Sarah Martinez had been a combat medic for 3 years, but nothing had prepared her for what she would face in the dusty streets of Fallujah. The morning sun cast long shadows between the damaged buildings as her unit moved through the residential sector, checking for insurgent activity. The air was thick with tension and the smell of burning debris from the previous night's attacks. She adjusted the heavy medical pack on her shoulders, feeling the weight of every supply that could mean the difference between life and death for her fellow soldiers. Her unit consisted of 8 Marines, including herself, tasked with securing a 3-block radius in the heart of the city. The intelligence reports had suggested minimal resistance, but Sarah had learned to trust her instincts more than paperwork. The first sign of trouble came at 0800 hours, when Corporal Williams raised his fist, signaling the unit to halt. Through the broken windows of a nearby building, shadows moved in ways that didn't match the wind patterns. Sarah crouched behind a concrete barrier, her medical bag positioned for quick access while keeping her rifle ready. The explosion came without warning. The building to their left erupted in smoke and flames as an improvised explosive device tore through the ground floor. Sarah felt the shockwave push her against the barrier, her ears ringing from the blast. When the dust began to settle, she saw Williams lying motionless 20 feet away, blood pooling beneath his left leg. Without hesitation, Sarah sprinted across the exposed street, zigzagging to avoid the gunfire that immediately followed the explosion. Bullets whizzed past her head as she slid behind cover near Williams, her hands already reaching for her medical supplies. The corporal was conscious but pale, his leg badly mangled below the knee. She worked quickly, applying a tourniquet while scanning the surrounding buildings for muzzle flashes. The enemy had chosen their position well, with elevated firing positions in multiple directions. Sarah's unit was pinned down with limited cover and no clear escape route. Sergeant Rodriguez's voice crackled through her radio headset as she bandaged Williams' wound. The insurgents had cut off their planned extraction route, and backup was at least 40 minutes away. They would need to hold their position and keep Williams alive until help arrived. As Sarah finished stabilizing Williams, another explosion rocked the street behind them. This time, the blast brought down part of a wall, creating even more obstacles between them and safety. She realized with growing concern that the insurgents weren't just trying to eliminate their unit. They were systematically destroying potential cover and escape routes. The gunfire intensified as more insurgents joined the attack from different angles. Sarah counted at least 4 distinct firing positions based on the sound patterns. Her unit returned fire when possible, but they were clearly outnumbered and outgunned. The medical supplies she carried became increasingly precious as 2 more Marines sustained injuries from flying debris and ricocheting bullets. Through the chaos, Sarah maintained focus on her primary mission, keeping her wounded teammates alive. She moved between positions under covering fire, treating injuries and redistributing ammunition. Each time she exposed herself to reach another wounded soldier, she felt the bullets getting closer, some striking the concrete just inches from her body. By noon, the situation had deteriorated further. The insurgents had brought in additional weapons, including what sounded like a heavy machine gun positioned on a rooftop 2 blocks away. The sustained fire made movement nearly impossible, forcing Sarah's unit to remain in whatever cover they could find among the rubble. Williams was losing blood despite the tourniquet, and 2 other Marines had developed signs of shock from their injuries. Sarah knew that without proper medical facilities, she was fighting a losing battle against time and limited supplies. Her morphine was running low, and clean bandages were becoming scarce. The afternoon brought new challenges as the insurgents began using smoke grenades to obscure their movements. Sarah could hear footsteps and voices getting closer as the enemy attempted to flank their position. Sergeant Rodriguez made the difficult decision to fall back to a more defensible position in a partially collapsed building 50 meters away. Moving the wounded across open ground under fire tested every skill Sarah had learned in her military training. She coordinated with the mobile Marines to provide covering fire while she and another soldier carried Williams to safety. The journey that should have taken 30 seconds stretched into an agonizing 3 minutes of dodging bullets and scrambling over debris. Inside the collapsed building, Sarah found a relatively protected area where she could better treat the wounded. The structure provided good cover from most angles, but she worried about the stability of the damaged walls. Every explosion nearby sent small pieces of concrete raining down on them, and cracks in the remaining walls seemed to grow larger with each impact. As evening approached, Sarah realized they had survived the first major assault. But the insurgents showed no signs of withdrawing. Radio communications with command revealed that the situation across Fallujah had deteriorated, with multiple units under attack simultaneously. Their backup was being diverted to assist other pinned-down forces, pushing their estimated rescue time to at least 12 more hours. The wounded Marines were stable for now, but Sarah knew that Williams needed surgery soon or he would lose his leg entirely. Her other patients required antibiotics and proper wound care that she simply couldn't provide in their current situation. She rationed her remaining medical supplies while preparing for what would likely be a very long night. As darkness fell over Fallujah, Sarah heard the insurgents regrouping in the surrounding buildings. Voices carried through the night air, and she could make out the sounds of additional weapons being positioned around their refuge. The enemy was settling in for a prolonged siege. Confident that time was on their side, Sarah checked her ammunition count and inventoried her medical supplies one more time. 3 magazines for her rifle, enough morphine for maybe 6 more injections, and bandages that would last until morning if used carefully. She looked at the faces of her fellow Marines, some sleeping fitfully despite the pain, others staring into the darkness with determined expressions. The first night in Fallujah was about to begin, and Sarah understood that survival would require every ounce of skill, determination, and luck they could muster. The insurgents controlled the streets around them. Help was hours away, and her wounded teammates depended on her medical expertise to see another sunrise. She settled into a position where she could monitor the wounded while maintaining watch through a gap in the wall. The distant sounds of gunfire echoed across the city as other units fought their own battles for survival. Sarah gripped her rifle tighter and prepared for the longest night of her life, knowing that the morning would bring new challenges and that her endurance was about to be tested in ways she had never imagined. The story of her survival was just beginning, and she had no idea that what she considered a terrible first day would pale in comparison to what lay ahead in the streets of Fallujah. The darkness brought no relief from the insurgent attacks. Sarah had hoped the enemy fighters might withdraw during the night, but instead, they seemed to intensify their efforts to eliminate the trapped Marines. Through the gaps in the damaged walls, she could see muzzle flashes from multiple positions as the insurgents maintained steady pressure on their refuge. Williams had developed a fever during the first few hours of darkness, and Sarah knew infection was setting in despite her best efforts to keep his wounds clean. She administered one of her precious antibiotic injections while wondering how many more medical crises she would face before rescue arrived. The other wounded Marines were managing their pain, but she could see exhaustion and dehydration taking their toll. Around midnight, the insurgents attempted their first coordinated assault on the building. Sarah heard whispered commands in Arabic, getting closer, followed by the distinctive sound of footsteps on broken concrete. She alerted Sergeant Rodriguez through hand signals, and the mobile Marines took defensive positions near the entrances, while Sarah stayed with the wounded. The attack came from 3 directions simultaneously. Grenades exploded near the main entrance, followed by automatic weapon fire from insurgents who had crept close, under cover of darkness. Sarah pressed herself against the floor while keeping pressure on William's bandaged leg, feeling the building shake from nearby explosions. Sergeant Rodriguez and his Marines fought back fiercely, their muzzle flashes illuminating the interior walls in brief, stark moments. Sarah could hear the insurgents calling to each other as they advanced, their voices growing closer despite the return fire. She prepared her sidearm while continuing to monitor Williams's vital signs, ready to defend her patients if the enemy breached their position. The firefight lasted nearly an hour before the insurgents finally withdrew. When the shooting stopped, Sarah discovered that Marine Davis had taken a bullet in his shoulder during the assault. She worked by feel in the darkness, using her small tactical flashlight sparingly to assess the wound while avoiding giving away their exact position to any remaining enemy observers. Davis was conscious and alert, but the bullet had passed through his shoulder muscle and potentially damaged important blood vessels. Sarah applied pressure bandages and monitored him for signs of internal bleeding, while wondering how many more casualties she could effectively treat with her dwindling supplies. The second day dawned with renewed enemy activity. Sarah could hear vehicles moving through the streets around their position, and radio intercepts suggested the insurgents were bringing in additional fighters and heavy weapons. Her unit's ammunition was running low after the night-long firefight, and several Marines were showing signs of severe dehydration. Mid-morning brought devastating news through their radio communications. Command informed them that the planned rescue operation had been delayed indefinitely due to a major insurgent offensive across the entire sector. Multiple units were trapped in similar situations throughout Fallujah, and available forces were stretched beyond their limits. Sarah felt her heart sink as she realized they might be on their own for much longer than anticipated. Williams needed immediate surgery, Davis required proper wound care, and all of them were operating on minimal water and no food since the previous morning. She began calculating how to stretch her medical supplies across potentially several more days of survival. The insurgents seemed to sense their advantage and began a systematic campaign to wear down the trapped Marines. Throughout the day, they maintained intermittent fire from changing positions, never allowing Sarah's unit to rest or relax their vigilance. Every few hours brought a new probe or assault that required defensive response and consumed precious ammunition. Sarah found herself moving constantly between treating the wounded and helping defend their position. During quiet moments, she worked to clean and redress wounds, while during attacks she took up her rifle to help repel enemy advances. The dual role of medic and fighter pushed her physical and mental endurance to new limits. By afternoon, the water situation had become critical. The building had no functioning plumbing, and their canteens were nearly empty. Sarah began strictly rationing water, giving priority to the wounded Marines who were losing fluids through their injuries. She felt her own dehydration beginning to affect her judgment and coordination. The insurgents appeared to understand their water predicament and began targeting what appeared to be a small rainwater collection system on an adjacent building. Sarah watched helplessly as enemy fire destroyed their only potential source of additional water, confirming that the insurgents planned to wait them out rather than risk further casualties in direct assault. As the second evening approached, Sarah tallied their resources with growing concern. 2 magazines of rifle ammunition remained, along with scattered rounds distributed among the other Marines. Her medical supplies were down to emergency levels. 2 morphine injections, a handful of bandages, and 1 remaining antibiotic dose. William's condition had stabilized somewhat, but he remained weak and needed constant monitoring. Davis was managing his shoulder wound well, but Sarah worried about infection setting in without proper antibiotics. The psychological toll was becoming visible on all the Marines, with fatigue and stress affecting their alertness and decision-making. The second night brought new horrors as the insurgents employed psychological warfare tactics. They positioned speakers in nearby buildings and played recordings of previous battles, including the sounds of wounded American soldiers calling for help. Sarah had to counsel her Marines to ignore the audio manipulation while dealing with her own emotional response to the realistic distress calls. Around 2 a.m., the insurgents launched their most serious assault yet. This time they used explosives to breach the building's main supporting wall, creating a large gap that exposed Sarah's unit to direct fire from multiple angles. She found herself dragging Williams to a more protected corner while under intense gunfire, feeling bullets pass close enough to hear their distinctive whistle. The battle raged for over 2 hours as insurgents poured through the breach and engaged in close-quarters combat within the building itself. Sarah treated a new shrapnel wound on Marine Johnson, while Rodriguez and the others fought desperately to prevent the position from being overrun. The sound of gunfire echoed off the walls in a deafening crescendo that left her ears ringing for hours afterward. When dawn broke on the third day, Sarah surveyed the devastation around their position. The building was barely standing, with gaping holes in multiple walls and debris covering most surfaces. 2 Marines had sustained additional injuries during the night assault, stretching her medical capabilities beyond their limits. Radio communications revealed that rescue operations were still suspended due to ongoing fighting throughout the sector. Sarah felt desperation beginning to creep into her thoughts as she realized they had survived 2 full days of siege, with potentially many more ahead. Williams was showing signs of serious infection, and her antibiotic supplies were exhausted. The insurgents had also paid a heavy price for their assault, and Sarah noticed a decrease in enemy activity during the morning hours. She hoped they were regrouping or possibly withdrawing. But experience had taught her not to trust such lulls. More likely, the enemy was planning their next move, while allowing the trapped Marines to weaken further. As the sun climbed higher on their third day in Fallujah, Sarah made difficult decisions about rationing their remaining water and medical supplies. She administered her last morphine injection to Williams while planning how to manage pain for the other wounded Marines. Her own exhaustion was becoming severe, but she knew that letting down her guard could mean death for her entire team. The morning radio check brought mixed news. Command reported that a rescue operation was being planned for the following day, but warned that insurgent activity made success uncertain. Sarah felt a flicker of hope while trying not to let optimism cloud her judgment about their deteriorating situation. She looked at the faces of her fellow Marines, seeing the same mixture of determination and exhaustion that she felt herself. They had survived 2 days and nights in hell, but the hardest test of their endurance was still ahead. As enemy movement resumed in the surrounding buildings, Sarah prepared for another day of fighting for their lives in the ruins of Fallujah. The third day in Fallujah tested every limit of human endurance that Sarah had never known existed. Williams had slipped into delirium from his infection, mumbling incoherently about his hometown in Ohio, while Sarah tried to keep him comfortable without any remaining painkillers. She had fashioned makeshift bandages from torn uniform fabric, but his wounds were showing clear signs of advancing sepsis. Davis had developed complications from his shoulder wound, with swelling that suggested internal bleeding she couldn't address with her exhausted medical supplies. Johnson's shrapnel wounds from the night assault were superficial but numerous, requiring constant attention to prevent infection in the dirty environment of their destroyed refuge. The insurgents had changed tactics overnight, positioning snipers in elevated positions to maintain constant pressure without risking direct assault casualties. Every movement within the building drew immediate fire, forcing the Marines to crawl between positions and limiting Sarah's ability to properly care for the wounded. Water had become their most critical shortage. Sarah's lips were cracked and bleeding, her mouth so dry that swallowing was painful. The wounded Marines were suffering worse, with dehydration compounding their medical problems and affecting their body's ability to heal. She made the desperate decision to collect rainwater in whatever containers they could improvise, despite knowing the risks of contamination. During the late morning hours, Sarah heard a new sound that chilled her blood, the distinctive rumble of heavy machinery approaching their position. Through the gaps in the walls, she caught glimpses of a bulldozer being positioned nearby, apparently preparing to level their building entirely. The insurgents had grown tired of the siege and were planning to crush them under tons of concrete and steel. Sergeant Rodriguez attempted to call in an airstrike on the bulldozer, but command responded that all available aircraft were committed to other emergencies across the city. The trapped Marines would need to survive this new threat with their own resources, which had dwindled to almost nothing over the past 3 days. The psychological pressure was becoming as dangerous as the physical threats. Sarah noticed that several Marines were showing signs of combat stress reaction, with trembling hands and 1,000-yard stares that indicated they were approaching their breaking points. She found herself taking on the additional role of counselor, trying to keep morale intact while managing her own growing despair. As the bulldozer began its approach, Sarah made rapid preparations to evacuate their position. Williams was barely conscious, and moving him would likely worsen his condition, but staying meant certain death for all of them. She coordinated with the mobile Marines to carry the wounded while providing covering fire for their withdrawal to a building across the street. The movement across open ground under sniper fire became the most terrifying experience of Sarah's military career. She half-carried, half-dragged Williams, while bullets struck the pavement around them, leaving small craters in the concrete. Davis managed to run despite his shoulder wound, while Johnson needed assistance from Rodriguez to reach the new position. Their new refuge offered less protection than the previous building, but it was further from the bulldozer's planned demolition route. Sarah established a makeshift aid station in what had once been a family kitchen, using a dining table as an operating surface while treating the wounded under increasingly primitive conditions. The destruction of their previous position sent clouds of dust and debris across the entire block, reducing visibility but also providing some concealment from enemy observation. Sarah used this opportunity to thoroughly examine Williams' infected wounds discovering that the infection had spread further than she had feared. Without immediate surgical intervention and intravenous antibiotics, he would not survive another day. Radio communications brought increasingly desperate news throughout the afternoon. Multiple units across Fallujah were reporting similar siege situations, with casualty rates climbing and rescue operations repeatedly delayed. Sarah began to accept that they might not see rescue at all. That survival would depend entirely on their own resourcefulness and determination. The insurgents discovered their new position before evening and resumed their systematic attacks. This time, however, Sarah noticed changes in their assault patterns that suggested the enemy was also suffering from exhaustion and casualties. The attacks were less coordinated, with longer intervals between assaults and fewer fighters participating in each wave. As darkness fell on their third night, Sarah counted their remaining assets with brutal honesty. 4 rounds of rifle ammunition per Marine, no medical supplies except improvised bandages, and water so scarce that each sip had to be carefully considered. Williams was dying, Davis was weakening from blood loss, and the entire unit was operating on willpower alone. The insurgents' night attack came with less intensity than previous assaults, but Sarah's unit was also less capable of defending themselves. She found herself using her empty rifle as a club during one close encounter, fighting hand-to-hand with an insurgent who had broken through their defensive perimeter. The physical struggle lasted only seconds, but left her shaking with adrenaline and the realization of how close they had come to being overrun. Dawn on the 4th day brought silence that Sarah initially distrusted. No enemy fire greeted the sunrise, and she could see no movement in the surrounding buildings. Either the insurgents had withdrawn, or they were planning something far worse than anything they had attempted previously. Williams was unconscious and burning with fever, his breathing shallow and irregular. Sarah knew he was dying, and that she was powerless to save him with the resources available. She held his hand and spoke quietly about home, hoping some part of his mind could hear comfort in her words during his final hours. The radio crackled to life mid-morning with the most beautiful sound Sarah had ever heard. American voices announcing an incoming rescue operation. Apache helicopters were en route to their position, with a ground extraction team following close behind. After 3 days and 11 major enemy assaults, help was finally coming. Sarah felt tears streaming down her dust-covered face as she heard the distinctive sound of helicopter rotors approaching from the east. The Apache gunships made several passes around their position, clearing remaining insurgent positions with precision strikes that sent clouds of smoke rising from multiple buildings. The extraction team moved through the streets with professional efficiency, medics rushing to their position while security teams established a defensive perimeter. Sarah found herself trying to brief the lead medic about Williams' condition, while simultaneously breaking down from exhaustion and relief. Williams was evacuated first, loaded onto a stretcher and rushed to a waiting medical helicopter despite Sarah's fears that he was too far gone to save. Davis and Johnson followed, their wounds finally receiving the professional treatment they had needed for days. Sarah insisted on walking to the evacuation point under her own power, though her legs barely supported her weight. As the helicopter lifted off from Fallujah, Sarah looked down at the destroyed buildings, where she had fought for survival for 3 days and nights. The city looked different from the air. Smaller somehow, less threatening than it had seemed when every street corner could hide an enemy sniper or explosive device. The medical team aboard the helicopter worked frantically on Williams during the flight to the combat hospital. Sarah watched their efforts with professional interest, noting procedures she wished she could have performed in the field. His vital signs were dangerously unstable, but he was alive. And that gave her hope that her desperate efforts to keep him breathing had not been in vain. At the hospital, Sarah learned that Williams would survive, though he would lose his leg below the knee as she had feared. Davis recovered fully from his shoulder wound, and Johnson's multiple shrapnel injuries healed without complications. The entire unit was recommended for commendations for their courage under extreme circumstances. In her after-action report, Sarah detailed the 11 separate enemy assaults they had survived, the medical challenges of treating serious wounds without proper supplies, and the psychological toll of extended combat in an urban environment. She emphasized the importance of medical training for all soldiers, not just designated medics, and recommended improved emergency supply procedures for isolated units. Months later, Sarah would return to duty with a new appreciation for the fragility of life and the strength of human determination. The experience in Fallujah had changed her understanding of what the human spirit could endure, both in herself and in the Marines who had trusted her to keep them alive during their darkest hours. Williams eventually learned to walk with a prosthetic leg and remained in contact with Sarah for years afterward, crediting her medical skills and determination with saving not just his life, but the lives of their entire unit. The bonds forged during those 3 days in Fallujah created relationships that would last a lifetime, built on shared survival of an experience that tested every aspect of their courage and endurance. Sarah's story became legend among military medical personnel, not just for the technical skills she demonstrated under impossible conditions, but for her refusal to give up when everything seemed hopeless. Her actions during 11 rounds of enemy assault in Fallujah proved that sometimes the difference between life and death comes down to one person's determination to never stop fighting for the lives entrusted to their care.